There we go. All right. Welcome, everyone. I am so incredibly excited to welcome Dr. Jim Lawrence to our lecture today. And Jim, if you do not know, was once the founder and director of J. Appleseed & Co., a publishing ministry of the Swedenborgian Church of North America from 1989 to 2002. They produced 35 books and pamphlets on Swedenborgian spirituality. He's currently the president of the Swedenborgian Church of North America. He has served churches in San Francisco, St. Louis, and Freiburg, Maine, and as the dean of the Center for Swedenborgian Studies. And he is, of course, my very dear friend, and I think we are really privileged to have him come and speak with us today. And with that, I'm going to pin him and let him take it away. And just a couple of housekeeping things before we go. Again, these talks are 90 minutes. We're going to have a lecture portion and then questions afterwards. If you have questions while the lecture is going on, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to be kind of moderating and emceeing casually. And I'm really excited for this talk. So if there's nothing else, I think, and Dr. Lawrence does have a PowerPoint, so there is a visual component. So if you want to keep your eyes and ears peeled, let's take it away.
All right. Hey, it's great to see all you folks here. I know so many of you. And it's delightful to have had a chance to come back to Johnny, having spent a fair amount of time once upon a time running J. Appleseed & Company, as Eleanor mentioned, which was a publishing ministry supported by the denomination that went from, at least my time with it, I had it for 12 or so years. And back in those days, that was mostly the decade of the 90s, started in the late 80s and finished in 2001, my time with it. And I had so much information on him. I got very interested in being he was such a fascinating character to learn about. I had a website and so forth, but I lost all of that. So, and I haven't really returned to Johnny for anything particular in my creative projects or scholarly projects, even though I collect Johnny paraphernalia in my office, and sometimes that's the first thing people see when they come in my office on campus. They'll see all this Johnny Appleseed stuff. But this agreeing to give this talk gave me a chance to dive back in a way that was useful for me, because I wanted to be able to sort of return to it, because since I finished my time with the publishing house, where I took his name and the idea of tossing seeds out to grow, led to the namesake of the publishing operation. And there's been a burst of scholarship on John Chapman, who he really was, especially by Michael Pollan, the famous kind of gonzo journalist who teaches at Ivy League places and is a visiting scholar, professor of praxis. And we'll get into his critique and presentation of John Chapman. So I've got a PowerPoint I'm going to start with, and I am probably most willing to pause along the way. It's not a super long talk, but I do have a lot of Irish in my genes, so I know how to really expand out the language over time. But I don't want to just give a long talk, so I'm happy to break it up. I cover three subjects, kind of three general topics, and they could each sort of be worth taking a gander at. And so let's see, here we go. So the three topics are Johnny Appleseed, cultural icon, Swedenborgian missionary, and a complicated legacy. So in terms of that cultural icon, he's a figure of history that is entirely discovered through what other people said. We have zero anything from John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed. There's no letters, there's nothing he wrote, there was nothing left behind in his estate. There's just a complete absence of anything from the figure of study himself. So there's a space in his life where he was completely unknown, began to be a little talked about because he was such a colorful character. So people over time would know about this colorful guy. But then there was a big breakthrough a quarter century after his death, when a writer tried to rediscover the stories told about him in the Midwest, and he became a big feature story in Harper's Monthly magazine when Harper's was fairly new, and this would be 1871. From there, with this big national exposure, there began this kind of memory and culture. There was nothing else in a significant way written about him for another 75 years, but that didn't matter because he had launched into kind of a cultural memory where he became actually thought of as a myth. So by the time we get to the mid 20th century, few people believed that there was a real figure. He was like Paul Bunyan or Rip Van Winkle. And then there was a major scholarly event in mid 20th century where a professor of English with a special interest in the folklore of the Midwest worked for 15 years, really digging out the factoid history that might be scavenged by a good historian, and wrote a significant book that established that no, this myth was a real person who had quite a bit of interesting aspects to his biography. And then on into our time where there's some new engagements with the role that John Chapman played in the unfolding frontier of the westward expansion by Euro-Americans. So let's see if I can. A quick thumbnail on Johnny is that he's born while he's born right before the Revolutionary War starts, and his father is a soldier in the Union in the North for the Americans. He's born in 74 up in the Boston area, but his mother died when he was just 2 during childbirth of what would have been a younger brother. But his father did remarry, and a few years after that, when he was 18 years old, he decided to just take off and be an adventurer. And his father allowed him to take his 11-year-old brother with him, and they survived as nomads, just 2 young, really, one's not even a teenager. They made their way to Ohio eventually. And we don't know a lot about their life, about how they survived, but they were surviving in the wilderness. The father decides to take the new family. There were more kids with the second wife, and they all went to Ohio to become homesteaders. And Nathaniel decides to stay with them. He moves in with the family. And from there, Johnny was on his own for the rest of his life. Back in those days, in the early westward expansion, you could get 100 acres of a land grant, a free land grant, if you could prove that the land had been developed with at least 50 trees, fruit trees, productive trees that had been established on the property. And so supplying those samplings became Johnny's life work. That's a quick thumbnail. The way he worked is he would go to Western Pennsylvania all the time, where there were a lot of cider mills. And here's a typical example of a cider mill in the 18th century. So all these apples are being crushed into pomace, and there's the excess, all the seeds and stuff are being shoveled over into bushels and put outside. Those seeds can be planted. So Johnny would take regular trips to Western Pennsylvania to get these pomace masses. He would load up a big raft, and head west. One bushel would have enough seeds to plant 300,000 trees. So that's how, for free, he at least free for the materials itself. He was able to get all of his raw materials for his business. So for the next 4 decades, John Chapman was a indefatigable worker. He owned a lot of land. He was not a pauper. He had as many as 1,200, even 1,500 acres at a time. So he would buy acreage, develop the acreage, and sell it to Western settlers when they reached a certain maturity. He had some homesteads in Western Pennsylvania itself, but Ohio was his big state where he did the majority of his work, until there was a lot that he covered Ohio pretty well. And then he especially moves into Indiana. He did go as far north as Michigan at times. He was known to have gone into Ontario, and he ventured a little into Illinois, but there are no proven settlements associated with any of these other kind of circularities, but he very well covered Ohio and Indiana and Western Pennsylvania, and sold many, many hundreds of settlements over the course of his career. Famously, not only did he not own a home, he wouldn't buy clothes unless he had to. Sometimes settlers would give him things. He liked to make his own clothes out of just cloth, out of sacks that he would cut holes in for his arms and legs. He was known for wearing kitchenware on his head for the headgear as he walked around. He rarely was seen to have shoes on. He did occasionally have shoes. Sometimes settlers would give him shoes, but he would be, even in the wintertime, barefoot. And he preferred being outdoors. He never used banks. He had his hiding places for money all over his territories, and it's never known how much money he had, but he was likely considerably better funded than the vast majority of the settlers that he was serving, though he himself had very little use for money. He didn't really need to go to, he only used the money to buy more land so he could continue helping the westward expansion become an established thing. So the research that Robert Price will be getting him to a second, the professor in the mid 20th century who did this exhaustive historical study on John Chapman, was able to detail some of these, mostly looking at deeds of property and the banking records of settlers, and some of the memoirs that were written by other people at that time to put together this story that reveals him to be, yes, extremely, you can use the word eccentric. I guess that's a fair term. He was one of a kind, but his personality was what also helped his memory thriving in culture. And just the irony that he was probably bordered on wealthy, but he was seen as dirt poor by people who knew him. So there's some other distinctive features of Johnny's life that are worth noting. He picked up a fair amount of Native American Indian languages. He was constantly interacting with Native Americans of different tribes and branches. in the territories that he was covering. And Johnny was very opinionated about botany. He was an expert in plants. He had picked up a lot of sort of naturopathy beliefs and opinions, and carried a lot of medicinal plants around with him, and was known as a healer, especially by Native Americans, but even by some settlers. So one of his characteristics was that he was seen almost having doctor-like skills in dealing with injuries and illnesses. Johnny was very talkative. Apparently a characteristic that ran in his family, people who knew the rest of the family, they were a chatty bunch. Johnny was very talkative. He loved talking with settlers. He was very opinionated about religion and politics. In this westward expansion, there's a lot of religion happening on the frontier. We have all of the established, what we today call mainline religions, that were very much moving into these areas. Ohio has an interesting historical factoid that it has more four-year private colleges per capita than any state in the country. And that's because it's the first state of the westward expansion. And all of the religious movements were establishing educational centers to be a place for promulgating the way they would approach matters of knowledge. And so there was a tremendous amount of what became colleges. And so there was a lot of culture was moving into the West at the same time. A lot of politics was happening, and a lot of religious Trump preaching was happening. And Johnny was known to be drawn to these kinds of gatherings. He wasn't afraid to go into settlements and towns. He preferred the wilderness. He preferred his unorthodox solitary lifestyle in the sense of living by himself and being very comfortable far away from other people for long periods of time. But he was also very happy to be with people, staying with settlers at times and going into townships. And so he was known to be opinionated, he was in favor of the westward expansion. That's part of the criticism of him today. And he was known for arguing with preachers, arguing doctrine with preachers. So he had a Christian witness, and we know now that he was very, very much by this time into Swedenborg. And so his Christian witnessing in both speech and with all of his literature handouts was Swedenborgian. Part of his kindness showed forth in his reverence for all life. He did not believe in cutting into plants. We'll get to that in a second. He was against grafting. He was against riding horses, making a horse work for you. And he was vegetarian. Interesting, the part of you can get a glimpse into his ethos, his passion, the way he saw the world, the way he saw the cosmos, and how to be a creative participant in that cosmos. He never had any weapons with him, would never have knives or guns. He believed in creating a positive relationship with creatures of all species, humans and otherwise. And he was, even though at that time, there was, of course, tensions on the frontier between Native Americans and the white settlers. And Johnny played a little bit of an ambassadorial role often. He was known to broker conversations. He was gifted in his ability in language with Native Americans, as I've mentioned, whereas most white settlers were not. And but he himself was a pacifist, and therefore he strove to create understanding and to solve problems that might be happening between the two groups. So Johnny dies in 1845, and now we get to that Harper's magazine article that comes out in 1871, So it's it's a quarter of a century after Johnny dies, and and William Darcy Haley was a Unitarian minister who um, had the Unitarians at that time had set up a seminary in Chicago. He had studied at Harvard for a while. It does not appear that he graduated, but he was at Harvard for a while. We don't know a lot about his life, but he had been from the Northeast. But we know that he went to Meadville, which is the Unitarian seminary in Chicago. It's still there. It's very small, but he went to Meadville, and the big emphasis with the Unitarians was to move west, as it was with so many of the other religious movements. And so he was part of a group that believed that it was kind of a calling to be caring about what was happening in the Western states. So he spent a lot of his time as far west as Kansas, and he was in Illinois for a long time. He pastored a couple of churches there, but he really was into writing and editing, and so he went after kind of a significant side career of being a writer. And so this is the biggest piece that he ever sold, was the one on Johnny. He had heard these stories about this person, but he says there in that first bullet point, there was one man. So he's covering like what are the stories out here on the farthest frontier, and he says there's one man whose name seldom mentioned now, save by some of the few surviving pioneers, who deserves to be perpetuated. Haley's testifying in this article that he's an obscure person, that John Chapman's become obscure, and hardly anybody knew who he was, but there were memories from the oldest people. And so he got interested in that as a story, and he writes, he digs up some more memories and testimonies, and he begins to see Johnny as a romanticized pastoral figure that was in some ways an antidote to the burgeoning industrial aesthetic takeover that was happening with all the factories back east. So he sees Johnny Appleseed as kind of an icon of pastoral beauty and a way to live in harmony with nature. But what the article does do is it puts John Chapman on the cultural memory map in a big way. It was a very, very widely successful publication from the very beginning, and so that's the second big part of the arc of Johnny as a cultural icon. Is a writer discovers him a quarter of a century after his death, writes a big feature story romanticizing him, and it catches on in the cultural imagination some. But in a way, what happens after the Harper's article is really just the beginning of a myth, because there was no follow-up to that. Part of that was because there was hardly anything to follow up with, right? And Haley was just able to know some people who knew him. There were still people around who knew him, and was able to collect that kind of personal testimony for that article. But very soon there would be no more of that kind, and there just simply is this gap that happens of any published writings of any significance in terms of really getting into the story of who this person was. So but the story itself does not leave cultural imagination. He becomes kind of a myth, and he takes on character. The story of him was so eccentric, so unreal, that it was like a mythic character, and he's treated sort of like Paul Bunyan or Rip Van Winkle. He becomes a myth for really quite some time in the first half of the 20th century. So that's the third phase of the cultural icon arc. That first he's unknown, And then there's a unknown except as a colorful person by people who knew him. But then a quarter of a century after his death, there's the big national magazine article. But then there's no follow with that, and it evolves into just a mythic, like colorful story of an American icon on the American frontier. So here we get to the mid 20th century book that was a watershed piece of work for understanding who John Chapman was. Robert Price, professor of English. Otterbein College is south of Urbana, about a half an hour. I don't know. Sue Dittmeyer, I know, is on this call. I don't know if Robin's here or anybody else from Urbana, but Otterbein is not far from Urbana, and of course Ohio State. And so his special interest was folklore, and he wanted to do primary source research on really scholastically bringing out more information, a better way to frame, a better way to feature, better way to understand the folklore traditions of the American Midwest. He spent about 25, he got fascinated by what he found. He found Haley's article and saw that there was a lot of potential nitty-gritty historical information that perhaps could be dug up by a professional historian like himself, which was to go to all of the county offices where you can get land grant information going all the way back, right? And put together a record that one can find in government and business materials, and continue to try to track down the memoirs, the stories told through family, through the generations, doing this sort of word of mouth testimonial research that historians will all also do. And he comes up with this book saying, looking at that subtitle, he's recognizing that this myth has grown up, but that there was a real man. And so Johnny Appleseed, Man and Myth, becomes sort of the Bible for, I have several copies of it. You can get them fairly inexpensively online. This is one of my copies. And it provides it's a tremendous gift for a scholar to do something like this and studying a particular subject. So that was the mid 20th century, where there was this very fulsome picture of a real human being who had this real business. Price is the one who gives us all the land information, all the money that was exchanged, the specific places that we can verify that he owned land versus a lot of the tales. Oh yeah, he was all over Michigan. Well, the records don't really support that he was all over Michigan. We know he went to Michigan, but that the fact of doing very many settlements there, the record didn't really reveal that. So Robert Price is the next big phase of the cultural icon arc of a fulsome research that there is a myth, but there's a real person behind it. And then the last arc is the one that we'll get to after this topic, which would be the contemporary studies of Chapman in the last 20 years that look at some of the complications of his biography and the American history story. But of course, a big one we care about here is that he had this reputation was among Swedenborgians a long time ago as this extraordinary missionary who heavily procured books, and when tracts were available, he got those, but usually he bought Swedenborg books and famously cut them up into chapters, and sometimes even less than chapters. And he would sew the stitches so that they were like pamphlet tracts. And he was a lending library as he would pass the word. We know the phrase, good news, right, fresh from heaven. So he spent 3 decades at least in a very excessively documented track record as a purchaser of Swedenborgian literature, and distributing it across wide spaces. This third bullet point is mentioned. Swedenborgianism was treated by most historians as an intellectual approach to the Christian faith. It tended to attract those with a lot of education. It was a language-heavy sort of denomination. And there are historians of Christianity in America that said most of the people that were joining the first generation or two of the fledgling Swedenborgian sectarian movement in North Carolina were primarily Presbyterians and Baptists, some Congregationalists, which are all sort of Calvinist denominations, who were therefore Calvinists, who were sort of fleeing a lot of the thought structures that were happening in those realms for Swedenborg's philosophy. Famously, he was popular with all the transcendentalists. This is that same period of time, and so there was not that it was entirely a blue blood movement. It wasn't. It had all of the classes in the earliest churches in General Convention. Nevertheless, it was still known as kind of a thinkers denomination, and it appealed to the well-educated. Johnny is the one person in our history who's on the frontier. Not that there wasn't plenty of neighborhood talk and that there wasn't many ways in which the lower educated spaces of culture were not also engaged in the Eastern Seaboard and other parts of the denomination. But Chapman was
Jim, we have a question. We have a question in the chat, which I'm very curious about too. How did John Chapman learn about Swedenborg?
Well, okay, we don't know the answer to that.
We have a potential answer in the chat. Herbert Ziegler says, I believe that on his way west, he settled in Pittsburgh for a while he befriended a Swedenborgian minister. Do you know anything about that?
I was hi Herb, who is from Pittsburgh. I was just reading today that it cannot be established that John ever lived in Pittsburgh. So that could be one of the stories that just could not be verified by data on the ground. But part of what is a little relevant maybe here is this slide, which speaks to the early days. So here we're going all the way back to 1817, and this is the earliest piece of discourse in the Swedenborgian movement about this person, and this is coming from England. They're hearing about him from England because the Manchester people, there's a Swedenborgian publishing operation in Philadelphia by this time, and Richard Schlatter is a big figure there, and he is also writing about this frontiers person who is just buying everything that he can get his hands on, and he's reporting, Slatter's reporting it in Philadelphia as well, that he's buying all this stuff up. And but in England, they're writing in 1817 that we're hearing about this person who is taking all the books of Swedenborg everywhere. As far as I know, that his knowledge of Swedenborg so predates any memories that Haley came up with or that Robert Price would come up with. These are the only two early thinkers. So we don't have any written record where the testimony is there. We have nothing from Johnny to speak to that. And so how he might have heard about Swedenborg, I think one thing the Pittsburgh thesis could have going for it is that he did go to Western Pennsylvania a lot. And so whether he lived in Pittsburgh may be a suspect, but because that's where he was going to get his raw materials. So it's that I think there's certainly a lot of attractiveness to that being a supposition with some historical facts that would make it seem as likely as maybe any other thesis that I know that he was coming across Swedenborgian groups in Western Pennsylvania. Could be. So this is I've already kind of covered the information here. It's interesting that he dies near Fort Wayne. He spent a lot of his later years around the Fort Wayne, Indiana area. And if you had to have a density map in terms of his years of the extent of time he spent in the geographies that have been mentioned, the area around Fort Wayne would be the densest. He had a lot of settlements in Northwest Indiana, and he dies in the vicinity of Fort Wayne. And a lot of people know of him at that time, at the time of his death. And the newspaper carried an obituary when he died. And it goes out of its way to talk about his religious opinions, that he was known especially for his Swedenborgian zeal. All right. Now for the last topic that I'll cover is that he comes into engagement again in this millennium, and Michael Pollan, who I'm sure some of you know, is a major writer on the American scene. He's not technically a scholar, and his books are not written like a scholar's books. However, he does have he's what I would call high-level nonfiction. He's sort of a gonzo journalist, done a lot of kind of journalistic style writing, tackles big topics. He's emerged as kind of a philosopher of culture. He's especially strong on botany and theories of diet, theories of the environmental issues on the planet, the way Homo sapiens should be engaging the issues of environmentalism, how it all plays into the way we raise, engage, consume plants, and he's had many posts in higher education. What a very increasingly popular thing called a professor of praxis. And a professor of practice is often somebody who doesn't have a PhD, probably has advanced degrees, but is especially known as having become a major force in the real world in a particular area of practice. And so they'll get these 1 and 2 year appointments as a professor of practice. And Pollan has been at Berkeley, Cal Berkeley. He's been at Ivy League schools, and he's clearly a kind of a frontline cultural thinker. So this is a 2007 book called The Botany of Desire, where he took 4 plants. He wanted to tell a view of the world looking at as seen through 4 plants. And the first one he chooses is apple. And he spends quite a number of pages talking about Johnny Appleseed. And a big theme of Pollan's is that Johnny's apples were of a variety that were basically inedible. So they were used almost entirely for hard cider. And in a sense, during these excessively vigorous years of the temperance movement, right? The number one, the 19th century, there were two enormous social issues that were raging in culture. The most important one was slavery and racism. The second one was the temperance fight. It was the most emotional kind of cultural argument that lasted into the 20th century, of course, with prohibition and so forth. And so Appleseed is pegged as being the number one liquor store in the Midwest, that his apples were almost entirely used for hard cider. And he makes that argument on the premise that Johnny was against grafting. So apples, which primarily came originally from Asia, and then they were in Europe, they scarcely existed at all on this continent before Europeans came over. Europeans brought them over, and then it's a very flexible, sturdy, malleable protein plant. It can grow in all kinds of places, and it changes to fit its environment. It's a real survivor. So that's why there's 100 different kinds of apples. You can keep graft. They're very easy to graft. You can graft apple trees to create new varieties, right? And so we walk into our supermarkets and can have quite the selection. And so but Johnny was against interfering with nature like that. And so he was against grafting and would speak out against it. But what I think is a little problematic with Pollan's argument is that another piece of that, I think even overestimates how many apple trees John Chapman is responsible for in the Midwest. He puts it in, he literally uses the number in the millions. I don't know, that strikes me as a pretty high number, but I'm not going to necessarily question it. The point is that everybody else began grafting Johnny's trees. So Johnny, it's true that Johnny himself probably had saplings that were turned into hard cider, but it's also true that his foundation laying of apple trees throughout the Midwest led in a very profound way into the varieties that we get later. The other big criticism of Appleseed these days is, of course, the land grab of Euro-Americans. I have a cartoon cut out of the New Yorker, if not many years ago, even decades ago. That's on my door in my office door on the campus. That has these two pilgrims on a Mayflower type ship. They're sailing around. They're kind of on starboard, talking to each other. Got their elbow up on the edge of the ship, and one of them says, "Well, no, absolutely, religious liberty is my immediate goal, but eventually I'd like to go into real estate," which is, of course, what happens. And Johnny was well known for supporting the westward expansion. So, of course, that's a conversation that is very complex, and who knows, we could get into it here. But all I'm pointing out is these days there's a very significant movement in our culture to try to address how thoroughly displaced people like me I've had my DNA done. Yeah, people get their DNA done and it's like, oh, I didn't know. It's something cool, I didn't know. Look at that, 15%. Well, there's nothing at all interesting about my DNA. 100% Northern tribes. I'm a barbarian all the way through. And I do feel responsible. I grew up in Oklahoma, um, which became the big relocation space, the biggest relocation space. My grandparents homesteaded a farm in Western Oklahoma. That farm is still in the family. And my great grandparents homesteaded a farm that just been passed down. Went out there all the time growing up. And the population in that township was about 75% Native American. So I grew up heavily contextualized around the difficulties of life that have been experienced by Native Americans through cultural disruption. And so it's a big issue in today's discourse. And you can look at a figure like Johnny, and he was complicated. He was friends with Native Americans, and he was a lover of all life. It never occurred to him. I don't think. I mean, I am reading into it. I didn't read the diary he might have kept, but that for him, it was just sort of normal for people to survive, and so, but he was very much an instrumental part of the Euro-American takeover of territory going west. So then there's the compliments, though, of Johnny Appleseed. 90% of the activity that you see around Johnny Appleseed today, whether it's in children's books or plays, events, annual parades, or there's all kinds of commemorations, is he works as an icon for children to be at one with nature, that the whole sort of loving persona of almost a Saint Francis of the American West really comes through, and teachers enjoy the materials because there's a complex way that they can engage history, they can engage outdoor trips and so forth. So there's a compliment given to Johnny in that sense, that that there's aspects of his life that's extremely inspirational and illustratively so for many generations of children, and it's not a small part of our cultural experience. So let's see, that might be. This is just a comment about the hard cider. That this Smithsonian magazine claiming that Appleseed's apples were completely distinct from the apples that we'll see today. They were used to be the alcohol beverage of choice, and so it's this kind of use of Michael Pollan is in many of the articles and the other books that have come forth. So Pollan is the kind of a cultural historian himself, and has framed John Chapman's work quite distinctively around the great alcohol maker for the frontier. A place to stop of my PowerPoint and maybe see if we have some discussions. Yeah, Eleanor,
Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely wonderful. Because I've heard you give different versions of this talk before, and I was kind of thinking about what you were saying differently, and yeah, it was just a really refreshing take on him. I really enjoyed hearing all of the kind of business stuff. Like, he was an entrepreneur. Like, he was he was out there like, you know, and that's such an interesting part of his character. So I really appreciated hearing about that. But yeah, I want to open it up to everyone else, and if anyone has questions, you can either unmute yourself or drop them in the chat.
I see Sue's comment that, well, I mean, actually, I don't know if they sold it. That'd be curious to know. I mean, it'd be interesting to get into the alcohol business of those decades and how the temperance laws were working and how it was hard cider being produced in a way that they could be sold. I mean, Pollen talks about that people just had it on their own property and they just stocked their larder with and it would keep for a very long time.
And be more sanitary to drink than water, I'd imagine.
This is Lon. I'd like to say something.
What's up, Lon?
Okay, what I'd like to say is that before you have hard cider, you also have vinegar. Okay, and vinegar was and still is a very healing substance to have, and multi-uses. And as far as the drink of choice goes, yes, cider could be made at home, and the water was not necessarily clean. So it's a multi-use beverage.
Pollen makes note of that too. That's a good. There were definitely, it was a safer drink, health-wise, and the stories got better as the night went on.
All right.
Well, there's one more thing. That's interesting that that lady's article mentioned that Johnny's apples were not like what you find in the market. That's because the stuff you find in the market have been hybridized and grafted to meet with longer shelf life and flavor, as opposed to utility.
We have another question in the oh, we have lots of questions in the chat. Okay, do we know if Johnny Appleseed's family of origin had a church connection?
Not much. In terms of religion, not much. There's nothing mentioned that comes through clearly. But again, there were so, when you do history work, how do you study a subject about which there is no extant information?
Yeah.
Well, you have to go try to establish extant information, and if there isn't any, then you make clear that that's true, and then what else can you say about it? And it's hard, and there's the biographic information that I've come across indicates that Johnny didn't have religion, doesn't appear in his story until he's a young man on his own. And I think where I would surmise as sort of extrapolating from what we know about his personality is that he liked conversation. And so that would be a very common thing to talk about with adults in his cultural context. And so religion, and then also we see with his gift of mind that he was a thinker. So that he would have been drawn to so we know he liked to talk about politics, and then he was very interested in the kind of philosophy of nature, so that his personality with his mental style and his chatty personality would be a reason for him to get interested in these topics. And one wonders about his schooling. Did he get
I think we tend to underestimate how much Swedenborg was just in the zeitgeist at the time. Like Swedenborg was just around. Like he could have come across it, 50 different places.
Yeah. Well, by that time, I mean, yes. So if we're looking at 1817 with that memo from England, the first reading groups on the East Coast started as early as like 1790. And then the first convention was actually that year, right? 1817, that we get that missive from Manchester. Well, that's the first time that there were enough reading groups around that somebody said, hey, why don't we get together?
Mhm.
And so the first convention was 1817, that very same year. And we know that there were some, I think I can, I've got the journal, I got the block book right here. I could look up how many societies were there. My memory is that there was about 35 or 40 societies at the first convention. And so some of them were going were in the interior. But he was also, but it all started in America, in Philadelphia. Boston's not it.
Yeah.
James Glenn lands in the Philadelphia harbor with the books.
Mm.
And the first reading groups were in the Philadelphia area. So Pennsylvania was ground zero, and it was a fertile state for Swedenborgianism because of all of the denominations. We didn't get any church members from England. It wasn't like Congregationalists coming over in a ship and then Presbyterians coming over and whatnot. There were no Swedenborgians coming over from England.
Right.
The American movement was entirely homegrown. And in Pennsylvania, it was interesting how many Quakers found Swedenborg attractive. So there's this high propensity of everybody's coming from other denominations in the first generations. So Pennsylvania, so I do think that you can make the case, the zeitgeist case, that there was definitely something going on that would not have been hard for him to come by if he had a hankering for conversation.
We have another question in the chat. A tangential query. As a Philadelphia Swedenborgian church member, the tombstone of Francis Bailey was moved from Temenos, Westchester, PA, to the Chapman Museum at Urbana. Can you confirm this? Many thanks. Do you know anything about that?
If Robin were here, she would probably know, and Betsy. But of course, there was a Francis Bailey building. I know there's Francis Bailey history materials at Urbana, but the tombstone itself, I'm not. Temenos, it doesn't make sense that it was at Temenos, because Temenos was purchased in 1990 or something. The tombstone wouldn't have been there. But if anything, so what could have happened though is the church that still partially exists at 22nd and Chestnut Street in Philadelphia is, of course, the church that was sold to buy the land. And maybe they did take away things like that. Maybe there was a Francis Bailey tombstone of some kind that was. I never heard that story though. So it'd be Susanna Curry might know and so forth. That's an interesting story.
Do we know where he got his Swedenborg books? Where like the physical copies?
Oh, you mean Chapman?
Yeah.
He was getting them from Manchester and from Philadelphia.
Okay.
So there was a Swedenborg Publishing Association that was started very
and do we know if he favored a specific one of Swedenborg's books?
I have not heard that. But in the times that he was purchasing, it would have been much easier to get True Christian Religion, and Heaven and Hell, and probably Divine Providence. But maybe they were, that would be a good study. It wouldn't be real hard to find that out, to look at what we can find in the collection about the earliest catalogs from the Swedenborg Publishing Association in Philadelphia. But in general, the big book that was used. We know in history, Heaven and Hell outsells everything in the writings combined.
Right.
By far. It's everybody, the power of the afterlife story is that Swedenborg was writing in a way that nobody else was. True Christian Religion, he was writing on topics that everybody was writing about. And that's exactly why he wrote True Christian Religion. True Christian Religion becomes the Bible of the sectarians, because they were arguing doctrine with other denominations.
Yeah.
And so Swedenborg is in his heresy trial when he's writing this last book, True Christian Religion, and he's pulling out all the stops. He's not being polite anymore. He's naming names. He's hammering the traditions. And so every chapter is lined up around a doctrinal topic.
Yeah.
And every chapter says, here's what the old church says, and here's what the new church says. And so the new church language advances in the last 5 years of his life in a dramatic way. And it really starts with his book, the second time he came back to when he worked on the book of Revelation. If you compare the massive text that he never published, which gets posthumously published in 6
Apocalypse Explained.
Yeah, Apocalypse Explained, Apocalyptus Explicata. 6 volumes. He stops at chapter 1910 and he never publishes it. Comes back to it and finishes. So when you compare those two, what he did publish and what he didn't publish, a dramatic difference is the way he talks about the new church. The first take is he's really emphasizing the universal church. He's emphasizing the deep values of the real church of Christianity, but he's using the language of the universal church. By the time he goes through that time period, in that same time period, which is about 5 years, by the time he threw down his pen at Revelation 19:10, which is when the rider on the white horse appears, and he goes, wait a second. And he does not exegete the next verse. That's very interesting. And he sets it aside. He'd already even prepared stuff for the printer, and he'd already done the title page with a nice signature and everything. He sets it aside and never publishes it. And when he comes, his cover is blown. The next year after that, he throws his pen down sometime in early 1759. Then we get the famous stories of his psychic abilities, the Stockholm Fire, the Queen's Secret, and the Dutch ambassador's receipt. They all happen within an 18-month period of time, with all witnesses and prominent citizens going, yeah, that really happened. He knew that stuff. that blew his cover. So in that 5-year period, when he threw down his pen, he's still writing everything anonymously. That's one thing that happens. And
that's what 5 years are those?
So he throws down his pen sometime in 1759.
Okay.
And we believe he started Apocalypse Revealed, Apocalypsis Revelata, in 64, because he tells us in Conjugal Love when he starts it, and we know he's not going to get it wrong. He's saying what he's saying in 68 in Conjugal Love is he's relating one of his stories, right? One of what we call the
memorabilia.
The memorabilia, the memorable relations, where he begins in the book that he does write about the Revelation is the first time he starts telling spiritual world stories. Before that, he would refer to his experiences. I know, because I've been going through, just trust me, I've seen, I've heard, but he doesn't actually tell stories in the texts themselves until Revelation Unveiled. And by the time, that's 66 when that comes out, 68, he's writing Conjugal Love, and he's telling a story where he says, after this big event happens, and it goes on for like 3 pages, the Lord said to him, that book that you began on the apocalypse, go back to it and bring it to a close within 2 years.
Mm.
All right, he publishes that in 68, which means, since we know he published it in 66, that means that he went back to it in 64. By the way, the most famous portrait of Swedenborg, right, by von Kramp, we've all seen it a million times. He's holding a book. He's sitting for a part. He's holding Apocalypse Revelation.
Yeah.
So anyway, but what happens in that period of time about the new church is he's in Revelata, he's clear that what's going on in the apocalypse he gets clear about the last judgment in a way that he still wasn't clear in 59. It was getting more clear. What the last judgment is 57. I believe he was working on the apocalypse as early as 54. And because he knew he wasn't going to finish the Bible. It had taken him too long to get through Genesis. And, he's looking at it, I am 65 now, and so I don't think I'm going to make it all the way through the Bible. So he jumps to the end of the Bible.
Yeah.
And then he starts retrospectively saying, these correspondences are everywhere in Scripture, right? Yeah. So he's retrospectively working. And a lot of the reasons why Apocalypsis Explicata is so big is so much of it is proof texting that this correspondence means this everywhere in the Bible. And he's giving 25 or 30 examples sometimes, right? Yeah. So that's going on. So in 59, my theory is that he began to see that there was more going, because so he lives through the last judgment by his own testimony. In 58, that's when Heaven and Hell comes out. You can see him rushing to finish the Arcana, by the way. He's galloping at the end, yada, 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 yada. He gets to Exodus 15 and 16, and he goes, I'm getting out of here. And he starts writing very quickly. And he's finishing in 58. No, he's finished that. He's publishing the last one in 57, and that's the year of the last judgment, right? So then in 58, he has 5 books come off the press. We call them derivative works because he's pulling them all from the Arcana. Heaven and Hell's the big one, but then we got the 4 little things. One of them's the last judgment. Another one's the white horse. Hello, the white horse. And so he's starting to rethink what really happened with all of that. We can see, he has this diary that he keeps for 18 years. And he's telling all these stories in his diary to himself. And they're wild. I mean, that's where Curtis Childs gets his phrase, off the left eye. I had this vision off the left eye, right? What a great title for, everything, right? So we can see, you can track in the diary that he's witnessing things that he's later going to say is part of the last judgment. All this stuff happened to the Germans, all this stuff happened. There's all this activities going on. So he comes back, but in the meantime, he starts having more and more arguments with the traditional church. He's intensifying his critique of what he thinks happened in the last judgment. What happens in the last judgment and what he publishes in 1766 is the judgment was on the Roman Catholic Church and on the Reformed tradition. That's the last judgment. They were taken down, baby, and everything was reordered and a new church arises, right? So there was a with True Christianity, that book did not go over well, by the way. Apocalypsis Revelata. He was giving it to everybody that he knew. Oh, this will change your whole life, right? This will change your whole life. Invest in this cryptocurrency, right? And let me tell you, the bishops of the Reformed Church and the bishops of the Catholic Church did not think very highly of that book, right? and so it is starting to intensify. Then the problem happens with the more and more people are reading Swedenborg. He became famous when when all the psychic stories broke.
Yeah.
He became famous. He was already a super established citizen with a reputation, but now there were cartoons about him. There were people beating a path out to southern Stockholm, the district called Södermalm, where he had his estate. People were trying to visit him, see him. He was a big cheese, and not necessarily a good way. But it raised his visibility in such a way that a lot more people were reading his books. And he gained a lot of powerful readers. There were people, significant people, who said, this is healthy stuff. This is healthy stuff. And so what started the heresy trial, which is how he really shaped his True Christianity book, is that out in the Western district, around Gothenburg, there were Swedish ministers preaching Swedenborg from their pulpits. That's the line that got crossed. That was not acceptable. So the executive bishop out there, the dean of the consistory, Ekebom, brings down heresy charges on Swedenborg, bans his books, and hauls him into a religious trial. And it never is settled, as most people know. He died before it was over, but because there were he had some fans too, so it was a sticky wicket. But what happens in the heresy trial is he starts writing True Christianity, and this is why it becomes the Bible of the sectarian churches, and why it's a book that Johnny probably got early on, is because this is the book that said, we've come to an epic ending phase in Christianity, and the era has been closed on the first Christian church. There's been a last judgment that has nailed the abuses that have become too insurmountable, and the church cannot be saved, and therefore it's been judged and a new church arises. So in True Christianity, he says, and this is what it looks like doctrinally. And he lists out every chapter, 14 chapters. Here's what the old church says, and here's what the new church says. And of course, it's the kind of language that we all know very well. And it became the #1 book in the westward expansion.
And it's interesting to me that people don't gravitate more towards the New Jerusalem as heavenly doctrines, which seems to be like doing similar work, but has a much more positive and less critical tone.
Well, I mean, the 19th century is a great study. There was at least 500 schisms in American Christianity. Everybody was arguing that all the churches we call mainlines, they had not only the big splits around slavery, but there were doctrinal splits like you wouldn't believe. And so there were so many new religious movements, so many schisms, so many breakaways. Then there were unions and unities. So it was a century of tremendous argumentation. It was all about creedalism and confessionalism, getting it right. And there were even jokes like Garrison Keillor has a whole hilarious thing on he grew up Lutheran, and he has some really funny spiffs on religion, and how they're having these meetings in farmhouses and whatnot, and they get an argument over this second half of one verse and one of Paul's letters, and 5 families stand up and we're out of here. So the Johnson move over to the Johnson farm, and the Johnsonite movement begins. And that's a joke, but it's a real. So New Jerusalem and its heavenly doctrine was not as popular in the 19th century because tame words were not effective. It was brandishing of swords.
Yeah. Heaven forbid we be nice to each other. Despite our doctrinal disagreements. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. If anyone else has any last questions, speak now, because I'm I'm absolutely delighted to have had you. This was a really, really wonderful talk, and really a fresh perspective on Johnny Appleseed, that I hope I hope people will be able to enjoy in the future. Again, we've had a little bit of trouble with recordings and getting them to save on Facebook, so I'm trying to get it to save on Facebook. I'm also recording it to my computer, so it will be available on YouTube eventually when I get around to it. All right, thanks everyone. Have a
Good
beautiful
to see
night.
everybody.
Peace and power.
And